Welcome to our episode 11 of our CHAIA series of reflections on faith and life based on our Bible studies and stories. We are now going to deal with the story of the first brothers, Cain and Abel, the first sons of Adam and Eve, according to Genesis 4. This is a story dealing with the problem of our relationship with each other, which appears to have become a very complicated issue, as it also determines very decisively our own relationship with God. How we relate with our brother and sister becomes a gauge of our own relationship with our Creator. There is this double dimension of how our life is to be lived. And there is the vertical dimension, which refers to our relationship with our God, our worship of Him, our religious practices and observances of our traditions of faith right in our church. It refers to our attempt to really know His will through the scriptures and through our prayer life. Okay, but there is also the horizontal dimension, which refers to our relationship with our fellows, with our brothers and sisters, how we regard them as fellow children of God, how we treat them and consider them as equal partners in our community and worship life, how sensitive we are to their own feelings, their needs, their longings and desire to be respected and loved as much as we long for it ourselves, along with our relationship with the rest of God's creation. This is the issue that is presented in our story. How our treatment of our brother, sister determines the quality of our relationship with our God and our relationship with ourselves. We will have more to say on this as we go on in examining and reflecting on our text today. Let us first consider the flow of the story. As it says in our story, Cain was the firstborn of Adam and Eve, humanity's first couple. And Cain was soon followed by the birth of the second son, Abel. Now we are seeing the emergence of humanity's first family, with seeming normal human activity being undertaken by each member. The two brothers went on to follow their respective interests and preoccupations. Abel pursued the life of a shepherd, keeper of the flock, preferably that of his own parents. Cain, meanwhile, became a farmer, a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain made an offering to the Lord from the fruit of his farming efforts. Abel, for his part, offered the firstlings with their fat portions from the flock. And then the Lord, without any prior notice of what kind of offering he prefers, became more pleased with that offering of Abel rather than that of Cain. And this made Cain very angry. Maybe Cain has good reasons to be angry. He must have exerted no little effort in harvesting all those fruit of the ground that he offered to the Lord with much enthusiasm. But why did the Lord choose the offering of Abel over that of Cain's? did he, at the very start, already expressed his preference for animal offerings over that of fruit or plant offerings? No. It just says God chose to give more regard to Abel's offering over than that of Cain. You can understand the feelings of Cain at this point. That feeling of being rejected, taken for granted, simply ignored, not being appreciated for the things that you have really taken much effort to accomplish. Cain could be justified in his anger. You see, God could have just chosen and favored both of them. Both offerings could have been been favored by God to preempt any jealousy, any anger from any one of them. But God made a choice. We did not know what was his criteria in making such decision. Could we say that God may have decided quite arbitrarily in making such a choice? Indeed, there could be times when we may be seeing God as one who makes arbitrary, even irrational acts and decisions that could be considered unfair, unjust, uncalled for in our own eyes. Why would God do that to a farmer who simply wanted to offer the spiritual fruit of his work on the field? Many times, God would not bother to explain to us the reason or the justification for his seemingly arbitrary or unjust decision. And so the reaction of Cain was just very human, in an experience of being rejected and ignored. But then God came to him and asked him, "Why are you angry, Cain?" Well, why would we be angry the moment God makes a decision which is contrary to our expectations? Why would we be angry when God exercises his freedom as God in his freedom to decide without the need to explain and justify it to his creatures? It would now appear that our anger, our bitterness, our tendency to protest and question God's actions in our lives is rooted mainly in our own personal interest, which God did not support. Cain, in his offering, had expected God to at least acknowledge what he has done, the effort he has put into making that offering, for God to at least render him some favor, some positive regard for such an act. But then it would all be about the self and not about God. We relate with God, we make offerings to God, not really to honor God, but to honor ourselves and to make ourselves stand out as among those who can be considered as most generous, most selfless in regard to making offerings to our God. This is what God has described as the manifestation of sin that is already lurking at the door, trying its best to take over and control our lives. Instead of losing ourselves right in the presence of God, we want to uphold ourselves, and we want God to be pleased and approve what we have been offering or giving out. We may be making offerings not to our God, but to ourselves. And this explains the automatic reaction of anger of Cain, because he has his own expectations with his own offering to God. He has his own expectation of how God should and must react and respond to his offering. This is when sin has already taken hold of him. The sin of being so self-centered. In short, it is already the sin of pride, the love of the self. But right in this story of seeming human failure and tragedy, here we also see the proclamation of good news, not once, but twice. First, when God told Cain, yes, there is sin always lurking around at your door, and its desire is always to take hold of you, to control you and your life. But, and here is the first good news, you can master it. You can master and overcome sin. Oh, when God gave us freedom and the power to discern, it remains there with us. In spite of what happened in the garden in the previous chapter, we still have the power to decide on what is right and what is wrong. We still have the freedom to decide. We did not become a fallen and doomed humanity after the disobedience of Adam and Eve. Our freedom remains intact. It did not disappear when Adam and Eve was thrown out of the garden. It is still with us. The freedom to reject what is wrong and sinful, and the freedom to choose and uphold and defend that which is right. That freedom is still with us. And that is really good news for us all. We are not doomed. It depends on how we will use our freedom. We use it wrongly and for advancing only our own interest, for ensuring only our own personal good and advantage over others. That is sin that will always take hold of us, enslave us, and will certainly doom and destroy us. Second, and so unfortunately for Cain, it turned out that his anger toward God was transferred to his own brother Abel, whom he treacherously killed out there in the field. The first murder was actually committed against his own brother, one's own brother. And what can be worse than that? And for what reason? Because Cain would want God to favor him more than Abel. He wanted God to declare him and his offering more acceptable to God than that of his own brother. How many conflicts have at their root very religious motives and reasons? Many wars, violent confrontations all over the world are usually arising out of our desire for our own religious beliefs, our understanding of God to be the more acceptable and more favorable idea and interpretation of God. Most religious wars are fought over God. We fight because we believe we are the ones chosen, favored by God, and those others are not. And so, we reject and hate those others. But this is the very profound message behind this text. The way we treat each other as fellow brothers and sisters is the very measure of our relationship with God. You can count how many times the word brother occurs in this story. 8 times. in just 16 verses. And that tells us a lot about the kind of values and relationships God, through this writer, is asking us. We have to love each other truly before we can genuinely manifest our love for God. Less than that is pure hypocrisy. This is clearly reflected already in the Gospels mentioned in the previous episode, wherein we hear Jesus teaching in Mark 12, 30-31, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, as the second greatest commandment, next to the greatest commandment itself, which is to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our might, and with all our mind. So, the same thing is being mentioned in 1 John 4:20. This is very clear that those who do not love a brother or a sister whom they cannot see cannot love God whom they cannot see. So we cannot love in the abstract. But then, here we arrive at the second good news here. In spite of Cain's tremendous failure to love God through his brother instead of himself, still God gave him enough protection for those who would set out to do him violence and kill him. A killer of his own brother would always be conscious and afraid of being killed himself. He is actually convicting himself, resulting in a deep sense of guilt and insecurity, lack of peace of mind, depression, and loss of hope for the future. But here is the expression of God's profound and endless grace being extended even to a convicted murderer of his own brother. He provided him with that mark of protection, labeling him still as a man under God's powerful and abiding protection. This is something he never deserved, something he never could have asked for. But this is the mystery of God's grace and love. Even right here in the Old Testament. Yes, even in these stories from the Old Testament, we can see lots of stories witnessing to the boundlessness of God's forgiving love and merciful grace, even to the most undeserving among His children. This is what we call chesed, love, undeserved and unearned and never worked for. This is purely grace at its deepest mystery, for which we can only bow down in deep gratitude and humility. This is what gives life its real meaning, light, and hope for us all. Thank you very much. Thank you once again for being with us. Next time we will deal with the story of Noah and the great flood in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. God bless you all.